I walked into that courtroom wearing a suit that smelled like mothballs and a life I didn't and oppose. Recognize anymore, clutching a leather folder that felt heavier than the 512 houses sitting on my dirt. And for 3 minutes, the only sound was the clicking of my own boots on the marble floor while every single person in that gallery looked at me like I was the monster under their bed. My name is Elias Thorne, and a year ago, I was just a tired civil engineer living in a cramped apartment in Portland, trying to forget the sound of my ex-wife's lawyer's voice and the way my daughter looked at me when I told her I couldn't and oppose afford her semester abroad. But life has a funny way of kicking you when you're down just to see if you'll finally bite back. The whole mess started with a jar of ashes and a sense of guilt that had been rotting in my chest for 6 years since my father, Silas, passed away and left me 400 acres of prime Oregon ridgeland that I had in Oppos. Visited once because every time I thought about that mountain, I thought about the man who spent 40 years trying to teach me that the only thing you can trust in this world is the soil under your fingernails. He bought that land in Oppos, 78 with cash he earned from backbreaking masonry work, and his last words to me were a wheezed warning to never let the bureaucrats touch a single stone of it. But I was busy, I was grieving, and I was drowning in a divorce that stripped me of everything but my pride in that deed. I paid the taxes every year like a good soldier, doing it through an automated portal from my desk, never looking at the maps, never checking the satellite views, just watching the money leave my account and assuming the pines were still standing tall and the wind was still whispering through the ravines. But then came the day my daughter, Maya, asked if we could finally go up there to scatter Silas's remains because she remembered the summers we spent camping under the Douglas firs. And as we drove up the old logging road, my heart started hammering against my ribs because the dirt track I remembered had been replaced by a 4-lane asphalt boulevard smooth enough for a Ferrari. I pulled my old Ford truck over when I saw the gate, a massive, obnoxious limestone archway that looked like it belonged in a French vineyard, with gold leaf lettering that read in quote, "The Cascadian Heights, a legacy community," in quote, and I just sat there staring at it while Maya whispered in quote, "Dad, is this the right place?" In quote, "It wasn't Oppos, just the gate. It was the sprawling sea of gray shingle roofs, the manicured lawns that looked like they'd been trimmed with nail scissors, and the rows of identical SUVs parked in driveways that were sitting exactly where my father used to teach me how to sharpen an axe." I stepped out of the truck and felt the world tilt, and before I could even process the fact that someone had built a small city on my property, a security golf cart whirred up and a woman with hair so blonde and tight it looked painful stepped out, looking at my dusty boots like they were a personal insult. Her name was Victoria Vance, the president of the Cascadian Heights Homeowners Association, and she didn't oppose. Asked who I was. She told me I was trespassing on private property and that in quote, commercial vehicles in quote, wherein and oppose. Allowed past the monument sign. I looked her dead in the eye, holding that jar of my father's ashes, and I said, in quote, "Ma and oppos. I and oppos. And Elias Thorne, and you're standing in my backyard," in quote. And she let out this little, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass, telling me that the end quote, Thorne claim, in quote, was a well-known clerical myth and that the developer, Miller Green Holdings, had settled all title disputes years ago. She called the sheriff right there in front of me, smirking while she told the dispatcher an, in quote, unstable vagrant, in quote, was harassing residents, and when the deputy arrived, he looked at my deed, the original, yellowed paper with the 1978 county seal, and his face went as white as a sheet of paper. He told me it was a civil matter, and he couldn't and oppose. Kicked me off my own land, but Victoria wasn't oppose. Having it, she started screaming about, in quote, community standards, in quote, and in quote, property values, in quote, until I just got back in my truck and drove away, not because I was scared, but because I realized I wasn't oppose. Just fighting a developer. I was fighting a hive mind of people who had paid 7 figures for a dream that was built on a lie. That night, I called a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a shark of a land use lawyer who lived in a house made of books and spite, and when I showed her the papers, she didn't into oppose. Smile. She just lit a cigarette and stared at the map for 20 minutes before saying, in quote, Elias, they didn't in oppose. Just build on your land. They forged your name on a quitclaim deed and filed it in a county office that's been understaffed for a decade. End quote. I wanted to sue them that second. I wanted the bulldozers out. There by morning, but Sarah grabbed my wrist and said, end quote, no, if we stop them now, they'll claim it was a mistake they and Oppos. LL file for bankruptcy and you and Oppos. LL spend 20 years in court for a settlement that won and Oppos. T cover your gas money. We wait until they sell the last lot. We wait until the HOA is fully vested, and then we hit them with a RICO suit that will strip them to the bone. End quote. So I waited, and for 8 months, I lived a double life, working my engineering job by day, and spent my weekends parked on a public overlook with a telephoto lens, watching them pour concrete into my ravines and pave over my childhood memories. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, watching Victoria Vance host and quote, wine and wagon quote, events on the spot where my father's cabin used to be, and the rumors started almost immediately. They didn't in Oppos. T just want me off the land. They wanted me erased, so the HOA started a and quote, safety watch and quote, thread on their private app, posting blurry photos of my truck and calling me a and quote, predatory squatter and quote, and a and quote, mental health risk and quote. And eventually, even my own neighbors in Portland started looking at me differently because the internet has a way of turning a victim into a villain if the villain has a better PR firm. The breaking point came when Maya called me crying because someone had sent her a link to a blog post claiming I was trying to extort and quote, honest families and quote, out of their life savings, and I realized then that Victoria and her developer boyfriend, Julian Miller, weren't in Oppos. T just thieves. They were sociopaths who thought that if they yelled loud enough, the truth would just give up and go home. But I had something they didn't in Oppos. T. I had Silas's old ledgers, the ones he kept in a fireproof box, containing every survey stake location, every timber sale, and most importantly, the original unnotarized agreement from the man who sold him the land, which proved that the end quote, ghost parcel and quote, Julian Miller used to secure his construction loans didn't in Oppos. T exist anywhere but in a Photoshop file. Then came the end quote, smoking gun, end quote, a digital recording I got from a disgruntled former secretary at Miller Green who had been fired for asking too many questions about why the title insurance was being handled by a shell company in the Caymans. On that tape, you could hear Julian Miller laughing about how, end quote, the old man Thorne, end quote, was probably dead in a ditch somewhere, and that by the time anyone noticed the discrepancy, they'd be halfway to a beach with the profit from 500 houses. I didn't in Oppos. T sleep for 3 days after I heard that. I just sat in my kitchen with a bottle of bourbon and the deed, feeling the ghost of my father sitting in the chair next to me, whispering that it was time to swing back. When we finally filed the suit, the explosion was magnificent. It was like a landslide that starts with a single pebble and ends by swallowing the whole valley. And, as the red, end quote, stop work, end quote, and end quote, title dispute, end quote, notices were taped to the model homes. The panic in Cascadian Heights turned into a fever. Victoria Vance tried to play the victim, going on the local news to talk about how a, end quote, bitter old man, end quote, was holding a community hostage, but Sarah Jenkins was already in the background, quietly handing the FBI the files on Julian Miller's wire fraud and the forged county stamps. I'll never forget the day I drove up to that limestone gate and saw the residents gathered on the sidewalk, looking at me not with anger anymore, but with the terrifying realization that their million-dollar homes were technically parked on my lawn. Julian Miller tried to meet me in a diner, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in a week, offering me $5 million to, end quote, make it go away, end quote, and sign a non-disclosure agreement, and I just looked at him, took a bite of my omelet, and said, end quote, Julian, you didn't in Oppos. To just take my land, you try to take my name, and $5 million doesn't in Oppos. T even cover the interest on my father and Oppos. S sweat. End quote. He started shaking, telling me I'd be responsible for the ruin of 500 families, trying to put the weight of their lives on my shoulders, but I told him that he was the one who sold them a house built on air. And I was just the guy reminding everyone where the ground was. The courtroom was the final act, and when Sarah played that recording of Julian and Victoria mocking me, the silence was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, and the judge, a man who looked like he had no room left for nonsense, didn't in Oppos. to even wait for the defense to finish their closing statement. He looked at Julian Miller and said, and quote, "You didn't oppose. T build a community, sir. You build a monument to your own greed," end quote. And then he turned to me and confirmed that the title was, and had always been, 100% mine. The gasps from the gallery were like a wave, and for a second, I felt the urge to turn around and gloat, to tell Victoria Vance that her, end quote, standards, end quote, didn't oppose. T mean a damn thing when she was sitting on a stolen chair, but I just looked at Maya in the front row and felt a hollow kind of peace. After the ruling, the law said I could have ordered the eviction, I could have brought in the bulldozers and leveled every single one of those luxury boxes to the ground. And for a few days, I really thought about it just to see the look on Victoria's face. But then I walked through the neighborhood at night, and I saw a kid through a window doing his homework, and a couple sitting on their porch drinking tea, and I realized they were just like me, people who wanted a piece of the earth to call their own. They just happened to buy it from a devil. So I did something that made Sarah Jenkins think I'd lost my mind. I didn't oppose. T evict them, but I didn't oppose. T give them the land either. I converted the entire 400 acres into a permanent community land trust where I stayed the owner of the dirt, but they could stay in their houses for a nominal lease that went directly into a fund to preserve the remaining 100 acres of forest. The HOA was dissolved by court order. Victoria Vance lost her, end quote, kingdom, end quote, and ended up facing a massive class action suit from the residents she lied to. And Julian Miller is currently serving time for a list of white-collar crimes that would make a mob boss blush. I moved back up to the ridge, into a small cabin I built with my own hands on the back 40, far away from the asphalt and the limestone arches. And sometimes I'll be out there chopping wood, and I'll see one of the residents hiking on the trails I opened up to the public. They don an oppos. They look at me like a monster anymore. They look at me like a neighbor or maybe a ghost that decided to stick around. And every now and then, a kid will ask me why I didn't oppose. To just take the $5 million and go to Hawaii. I tell them the same thing my father told me. That money is just paper, but the land is a story, and you never sell the ending of your own story just because someone offers you a bigger pen. But now I have to ask you, if you woke up and found out your house was built on someone else's history, who would you blame? The man who owns the dirt, or the man who sold you the dream? And if you were me, could you have walked away from $60 million just to keep the trees standing? Or is every man's price just a matter of how many zeros are on the check? Let me know in the comments, because I'm still trying to figure out if I'm a saint or just a different kind of stubborn and don and oppos. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who decided to fight for the ground they stand on.